Welcome, everybody, especially to those who are following us from the web. You're always numerous. This is the fourth season, it's the 44th Backstage Conference. And today we go a little bit off the automobile world and we will talk about aviation engines, aviation companies, and many other things revolving around today's topic, which is the Damascus-Paris from 1937, which was a real competition and could be comparable to many other competitions that in the automobile world we've seen in the past, but which specifically this time is an international competition among planes on a long distance with all the characteristics of the automobile competitions, and we will see a few differences in a bit. Of course, the connection between airlines and Alfa Romeo were engines. As a matter of fact, the S.79, which competed and won this game, were powered by Alfa Romeo engines. Alfa Romeo has a history which is deeply intertwined with the airplane world, and it's a story that begins to unite the two worlds since the early days of Alfa Romeo. It will be the first engine, as a matter of fact, the first design of Alfa Romeo, still Alfa in 1910, to be dedicated in parallel to the automobile world and to the aviation world. Today, as always, we have some special guests, Paolo Miana, who threw at us the idea of this conference, and through his activity, the archives, the editorial work, is servicing the aviation world. And then we have a representative from Volandia, who's one of our neighbors, but also, I would say, a partner with Pierluigi Galli, who I see in the audience, and Luciano Zimondi, who is here with us on the stage. While connected from remote, we have Colonel Paolo De Vita from the aeronautics, because this production, in the case of Alfa Romeo, was mostly devoted to a military use, and also this competition had strong contact points with the army. So, just a brief introduction. Starting from the biplane, Santoni Franchini. Santoni and Franchini were two employees of Alfa. One was a technician, and the other one, apart from being a technician, was also a test pilot, who started in 1909 to design a biplane, an entire airplane, the only one produced by Alfa Romeo in its history, powered by the first Alfa engine, 4 cylinders, 4 liters, 40 horsepower, which would then equip the 24 HP. That is the first Alfa in history in 1910. This project was developed autonomously, but then in 1911 the airplane did the first flight, piloted by Franchini, who flew for the first time. So he was invented a designer, pilot, and pilot tester. So the biplane had a history of a couple of years, and then in 1907 it would be destroyed because the hangar where it was parked collapsed. But during that time, the history with Alfa parted. And then there was a little pause, and then there was a full production of airplane engines, which characterized the 30s. So this was just a parenthesis, because while the aeronautics engines were based on licenses, first the Havilland with 7-cylinder slings, and then Jupiter from Bristol, and all the other derivations, like the 126 that we will talk about today, and then for the liquid-cooled engine with Daimler licenses. And then Colombo engines were also assembled at the time. But what is an interesting period is that after the 24 HP, Alfa Romeo tried again to contaminate the aeronautics world with the automobile world by building an aeronautics version destined to Capronicento, the Caproncino, of the C1750 Grand Sport. And this would be tested in the company. Some modifications were needed. The rotation sense was inverted. A different lubrication was created. But it would have been tested also at an altitude. It would have been tried on the Stelvio Pass. While the Caproncino will be protagonist of a challenge with 8C 2003 Monza, where the automobile was always the first in terms of acceleration, but then on the long distance it was overpassed. And by the time the aeronautics production in Alfa became not only important but also prevalent. As a matter of fact, if Prospero Gianferrari at the end of the 20s would sign these licenses and started to think that Alfa Romeo had to diversify its production in order to survive, it would only be with the entrance with IRI and demilitarization in 1935, the airplane production would become definitely prevalent. Let's think that in 1936, only 6 automobiles were produced by the Alfa Romeo, had 5,000 employees at the time. So it was very important, also this aeronautics production, which took place in Milan at the Portello, but there was a new plant in Pomigliano d'Arco that was built very close to the Alfa Sud, which was called the San Martino airplane plant. It was very good in terms of production because it was built from scratch. From the top, it had the shape of an airplane, so the productive pavilions represented the wings, while the administration offices were the tails, and then there were the rows representing the fuselage. But in reality, San Martino plant had to be a model plant from all points of view, also from the social point of view. It was the idea of a factory/city, which also included not only production offices, but also houses for the employees, not only the managers, but also for the workers who could use the sports center, the schools inside it. And Alfa Romeo bought some fishing boats also in order to provide fresh fish for the canteen. So it was a self-sufficient plant, representative of the time, but was headed into the future because starting from 1938 and for all the Second World War, the plant was bombed several times. But after the war, production resumed, and it would produce and revise also modern conception engines. In Pomigliano d'Arco, also the F104 engines would be built. What we see here is the opposite side of a coin. It is the fact that Alfa Romeo at one point decided to go military, also made it one of the main targets. The Portello plant was bombed 3 times between October 1943 and the entire 1944. What we see in the top image is an aerial picture of RAF, which shows all the places where the bombs were dropped, and the Portello, which was bombed several times, would only be hit by limited damages, both in terms of buildings and casualties. Different thing would be for Pomigliano, where the human casualties were limited, but the plant was partially destroyed during the Second World War. The aviation production, in the case of Alfa Romeo, had, as we've seen, industrial sides and sports side, but also communication elements. There will be many, many commercials, books, leaflets, and press presences at the time that underline how Alfa was one of the prides of Italy at the time. It was also one of the regions for which it was including the IRI and maintain it alive, even though at the end of the 20s, in terms of automobile production, it was almost bankrupt. Anyway, let's get back to the main topic of today's backstage, and let's talk about who a company which at the time had built part of its reputation with races had to defend this also outside of the tracks on a wider track with many issues. But I want to give the floor to Volandia before giving the floor to Palomiano, so we can listen something about our two closed museums, but also what we have in contact also in terms of people and visitors. Yes, we are neighbors. Volandia, Parco e Museo del Volo. Well, it's an aviation museum, but we also have exposition part with automobiles. We have about 130 helicopters and planes, but we also have 89 automobiles from the Asi Bertone collection and 3 cars from Flaminio Bertoni, who almost everyone forgets was a man from Varese, who then went to France. So our vocation is aviation, but with an eye also on cars, thanks to these two collections. So what do we have of Alfa Romeo and Volandia? Well, we have engines. I see an incredible Alfa Romeo 128. We also have an Alfa Romeo 128. We have the Alfa Romeo 128 coming from the so-called Sparviero, and Paolo will probably talk about this. Paolo will talk about the 126. We have a Gypsy Queen mounted on a Fiat G46 from Alfa Romeo. A Gypsy Queen, which was in the Istres-Damascus, was, if I'm not wrong, Paolo, you know better than me, was the sixth, it was a Derilan, Derilan de Havilland, with these gypsies, which then the Alfa Romeo would produce by license. It was a plane which was produced for 30 years, for the 30s till the post-war period. So you can just imagine the engines that Alfa Romeo produced and how reliable they were in those years. So I invite you to come to Volandia. I invite you to come and see what I told you, that is 130 airplanes and helicopters, which is Leonardo or former Augusta, the Jet 104, G91, produced by Ermacchi. Let's not forget we are in the province of Varese. The province of Varese is the province with wings, because in 20 kilometers there were 4 aviation factories: Semarchetti, Caproni, Ermacchi, and Augusta. So I invite you to come to Volandia. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you for this important occasion also to present our museum. Thank you. Well, I thank you for participating and accepting our invitation, and I also invite you to go and visit Volandia, because in this area you're just a few minutes away from us. There are several excellencies for the NG lovers, and Volandia is an unmissable step. We are just in front of Malpensa Terminal 1. Okay, thanks again. But if we go back to today's topic, we see here a small publication that Alfa Romeo issued at the end of this competition. So it's information booklets that for the general public were seen as press releases which were sent to the magazines, but the same graphic was also published as posters in the plant, but then many of these leaflets or booklets were directly sent to Rome, the ministries, and so the most important figures of the time to reinstate the successes of this company. So that even though it had aviation production was identified mainly for automobiles. But now, together with these booklets, our documentation center, as you can also see in front of you, apart from the contracts, the technical materials, the manuals, and many documents linked to the aeronautics production, also keeps track and protects, and maybe this is the most important and interesting part of the archive, a series of telegrams which are divided into macro categories. In this case, we see the update telegrams which are sent from the several points to say that everything was going okay, that the planes and the engines were behaving and working okay, but then there was also another group of telegrams having a different nature, and which were congratulations telegrams, in this case coming both from SIAI, which assembled the planes, but also from Rome, where the army, but we have also others coming from other ministries, but congratulated for the incredible results obtained. So Alfa Romeo, being a state company selling on the international market, also lived on these public recognitions. Paolo, I don't want to steal your time. I leave you the floor, and I ask you to tell us something about this plane, this competition, and what was necessary to win it. Well, thank you, everybody, and I would like to thank Lorenzo and Alfa Romeo for inviting us. It is a unique occasion to talk about aviation engines and competitions in a place where these engines were born and were created. So I do this also on behalf of my collaborator Matteo, who's home, unfortunately, ill and could not be here with us today. So I will also share with you his part of presentation. Just a quick introduction. For the Italian political situation in 1937, Italy was facing at an international level quite a complex moment. After the invasion of Ethiopia, we were sanctioned by the Society of the Unions, and somehow our state had to regain credibility. So the fascism at the time decided to bet on aviation, which was an extremely modern technological element. So they wanted to realize a new image of the Italian state through successes in competitions. So the aviation was chosen to champion this new regime, a modern and a technological and modern country. So one of the competitions that decided to take part in was this Istres-Damascus-Paris. Well, the airplane, which was selected with several others to take part in this competition, was the S.79, produced by SIAI in Sesto Calende. So the plane was born in 1933. The project was a competition plane, but it was a completely different vehicle from the one we know. In 1934, the first prototype was produced as high-speed passenger transport for 8 people. We can see so this was the prototype of S.79. In this configuration, it also had a non-Alfa Romeo engines. I don't want to say the name of that producer. As you can see, it was destined to the civil market and for the transport of passengers. This is a picture of the cabin of the prototype of the S79. As you can see, the seats are completely different from the ones we are used to nowadays, and the space, the overhead compartments, was as limited as today. So the vehicle then evolved to become a competition plane. The construction elements remain common to the prototype and the military version. In particular, the wing was completely linear construction with longerons and dozens of structural elements, creating a robust wing. And then there were other wood and fabric material, and then waterproof paints. During the Second World War, this would prove to be an extremely useful element, because if planes ditched in the water, they could float for several hours. The fuselage, instead, was a trellis metal structure. I want to show you some images. As you can see, it was completely realized in metal tubes. The characteristic of this structure was that a steel alloy was used. It was expensive, difficult to find. In order to avoid problems of supply, Marchetti created a structure with very thin tubes, 8 or 7/10 of millimeters of thickness, which is very limited. Also, the tails were realized in metal structure, and as you can see, they are all almost welded tubes. The structure was incredibly complex. If there is someone who is a welder, well, you can assess the complexity of this structure. There are at least a dozen tubes that all are welded in a perfect way to avoid damages or deformation. Well, the fuselage was then covered in different materials. Mainly the back part was covered in fabric, in canvas, and this would become one of the most well-known aspects of the plane during the Second World War, because there are several reports from the English jets which reported they fired at S-79, they hit it, but they didn't see the apparent damages because the bullets went through the canvas without damaging it. And you can see the result of this. There's a series of drawings on the fuselage where the plane received a bullet. The rest of the fuselage was in a metal structure. The front part in particular was an aluminum envelope, which was also used as a partial protection for the crew. Now let's talk about performances. S-79, even though it was a bomber, was considered a high-performance vehicle. It replaced the previous generation of airplanes, which was made up mainly by S-81, even though made by SIAI, but the performance leap was incredible. The S-79 was at least 1.55 quicker than the S-81. It was an extremely complex machine to be piloted, which required constant corrections and high care. So the situation was so worrying that the first battalions, having the first S-79s, didn't receive pilots or crew, but these were actually chosen among the best of the best. It was a very specific situation. So this situation performances was due to the care in the construction of the airplane and the structure, but most of the time was due to the propellers created by Alfa Romeo. The Alfa 125, Alfa 126, the 125 will be mounted on the prototype. The 126 will be mounted on most of the S.79 build. So they had Bristol license derived from Pegasus, 9 cylinders, air-cooled, which despite not having a maximum power, which was incredibly high, were extremely reliable on the long distance. The engine was a classical example of the production of the second half of the 30s. The power was not incredibly high, but it was an extremely reliable engine on which you could count. The S.79 was equipped with 3 of these engines, so it was a further guarantee of safety. This is one of the images taken from the catalogs, which are also available at the documentation center of Museo Alfa Romeo, showing in particular the lubrication system, the oil circuit in the engine, and we can also see other construction details. This instead is a picture of a military S.79, where you see the installation of the engines. They are completely without the covers and the aerodynamics covers. The ring that you see in the front is the manifold, exhaust manifold. We are used to see the exhaust at the back or towards the back, the tail of the plane, but in this case Alfa 126 had these exhaust manifolds in the front. It's typical. And here we see an Alfa 126 mounted on the S.79, which was produced for the competition. We see that some details, the helix for example, are different to guarantee the maximum aerodynamics penetration and best characteristics. This is a picture of an S.79 for the competition. This is maybe one of the best pictures that you can find of this kind of airplane. It comes from the historical archives of Serra Marchetti. I don't know whether you notice it in the picture, but on these exhaust manifolds that I showed you before, there are chalk, letters and comments written with chalk that make you think that it was tailor-made for this plane. So each manifold was connected to a propeller for a specific airplane. We can then go to the next part. It was the part that my colleague Matteo should talk about. Well, there's a series of short movings. This plane is in Trento, the Gianni Caproni Museum of Aeronautics. It allows you to see how the S.79 was built and which are the main differences between the military standard version and the race version used in this competition. Here you see through the graphics that the hunch where the defense, the upper defense area was positions was completely eliminated to improve the performances and the aerodynamics effects, at least in a sports competition setting. And then there's another video where you can see the front part of the fuselage with the engines installed. In this case, it's the Alfa 128 that you also see here showcased at the museum. The airplanes of the competition, as we said, were equipped with Alfa 126. Here we have an overview. You see here 2 outlets, which are the emergency doors for the crew on the S.79 in Trento. These are not installed. Then we go towards the wing, where we see one of the external engines and the tail. As we were saying, always in metal structure covered in canvas. Here, there's a series of information. What you see is the fuel tanks in the competition variant. So compared to the usual 9, which were in the wing of the military one, the race planes had two huge supplementary fuel tanks in the bomb compartment. This new configuration brings a series of problems because the barycenter of the plane shifted towards the tail, so Marchetti had to change the structure of the fuselage, which was modified, so moving the central engine 15 centimeters ahead. Here we see another video of the front part of the fuselage of the plane. And this brings us to another of the big modifications we see in the competition planes. Since in the central part these two additional tanks were added, the classical door, which was in the back part of the fuselage, was completely closed. A small access door was created. I would probably not fit in it. So the pilots were less tall than today, so the crew passed through this door and went to the cabin. Here you see again the classical access door. So you see the so-called keyboard, the element that allowed the bomber to drop bombs, and the gray structure that you see to the right of the picture is the structure supporting the bombs during the flight. You see some details of the tanks in the wing with inspection doors. So now I have finished my speech. I thank again all of you for inviting me, specifically Alfa Romeo, the museum, and the Museum Gianni Caproni of Trento. Thank you. Thank you, Paolo, for explaining this part. I also thank Alberto Grampa, who brought a model that you see showcased here, and which shows, well, it's an original model of the time, showing also the red color, which was unusual for an airplane, especially in the way you would imagine it. But red was the color that Italy used in the motor sports and motor competitions. So in this case, they used red. What you see showcased here is the Type B in its version, the most aerodynamic version, and it's one of the contact points between the airline world and the automobile world, because Alfa Romeo, knowing that in view of the Lavos Grand Prix near Berlin was not as powerful as some other brands in terms of engines, asked Mr. Pallavicino, who was working for Breda, to develop, back and forth the Milano Laghi in a series of tests that were widely photographed, to develop an aerodynamic chassis quicker than the standard Grand Prix vehicle. So this vehicle would prove to be quicker than the normal chassis, arriving at 165 kilometers per hour, and with gimbal they would win the Lagos Grand Prix in a competition where the pilots of the time, the best pilots of the time, rumor has it, didn't want to pilot these specific fuselage and chassis, which had a very narrow driving space, and pilots at the time wanted to be free in their movements, and they also wanted to jump quickly out of the car in case of accident, because in the races at the time, one of the big dangers was fire. Now, we get to the sports part of this competition, so I welcome Colonel De Vita from the Italian Aviation, connected through Zoom, and which I thank for giving us his time and competence. Thank you, Colonel. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me correctly? Yes, very well. Perfect. Well, I thank you, and I would like to send my greetings to everyone, but with Paula especially, who's a friend of mine. We're always in contact for researches, anecdotes, and sometimes we spend hours on the phone exchanging stories. Well, to give more context to my speech, I did some researches in the historical archives of the aeronautics to see whether we had something new concerning this competition. And I found a document which is extremely interesting and which is a report on the race done at the end of the circuit. So a sort of a report done for the authorities and to describe the issues, why that car won, and also, well, that vehicle won, and why also some technological additions were done to the vehicles to make them more efficient. So here you can see, for example, the arrival at the finish line with the 3S79, first, second, and third place at the competition. Other Italian vehicles participated: S79K, the military one, and the 2BR20, which for different problems could not get to the finish line. So, as I said, this is the report which is present in the historical archive, which is also available if you want to come to us and you want to know more. There's really a lot of information around this competition. So I tried to take the most interesting things. For example, here it's two excerpts of this review explaining us that in the beginning it should have been at New York, Paris, not a Istres-Damascus-Paris. And then for political and financial reasons, because the Americans feared on the Atlantic some accidents could happen just in the moment when they were trying investments for the Atlantic routes, the passenger routes between Europe and America. So that's why they went and found this new circuit. And as the report states, according to the new route, new problems were born because the New York Paris was 580 kilometers, but Istres-Damascus 6,200. And also the landing in Damascus could also be avoided. I mean, it was not compulsory for the competition, so our technicians wonder whether landing was necessary or it could be done non-stop. So without the stop, they would have needed more fuel. So increasing by 1,000 kilograms the weight, as Paolo was talking about, weight and centering, so 1,000 kilos of fuel on the vehicle. So in order not to make more modifications, they decided to land in Damascus. And then the calculations of fuel were done by the milliliter, because in the Paris-New York, they calculated that tailwind would have been about 130 kilometers per hour. Here, in the longer run, wind would be headwind, not tailwind. So before I was saying that some modifications were experimented and then put in place in the competition. Well, the first were on the turbines. Paolo, it was two step right, two step propellers, rotors, and then they decided a continuous drive. And then these small engines regulating the propellers were one of the causes that didn't allow all the planes to get to the end of competition. As you can read here, it has the possibility of progressively changing. Then another modification was the automatic dozer. So it was not the pilot who had to calibrate the mix, but it was a system which could guarantee the same flow and quantity of fuel. And consumptions were one of the main problems to check. And also in the change of altitude, which was required this European stretch rather than the Atlantic one, so keeping into account of the fuel consumption was very important. So here you can see that this modification was done for the Alfa 126, while for the other vehicles another kind of automatic dozer was used. In the next slide we can see the other improvements which had been made, what we call today the ECT and ECHP, so the exhaust temperatures and cylinder temperatures. And then thermoelectric, the modern CHT were applied, measuring temperatures in the hottest areas. And here, always talk about curiosity. I have a question for Paolo, because here on the Alfa 126, well, there were warmer heads in, but it's air cooled. So in theory, they should have the same temperature, more or less, I think. And then, of course, there were oxygen inhalers above 6,500 meters to pass the Alps. Some performance were needed, and then distant thermometers to check temperature outside in order to avoid the creation of ice. So we go to the start of the competition. Well, in the report, well, there's a description of the couple of days of debate between the participants in order to decide the start of this competition, and then they agreed. So, by nations, France, England, and Italy. And each pilot could decide the order of the vehicles. So as you can see in the slide, so we see that first the slower vehicles started, and then the S.79 by seniority, but in the opposite way, seniority of pilots, and all the starts happened without problems, smoothly. And here we have something interesting that I wanted to highlight. So all the vehicles arrived at Damascus with a lot of advantage compared to the competitors. And then here you can read the competition had to be considered won. So at Damascus you knew that Italy could not be beaten by competitors. That's why they decided to put in place a conservative strategy to keep the engines under control without losing risking to lose vehicles on the last stretch, which was the most complex one. And here we start seeing the first errors, so to speak. So here, for example, it says that Lirobo touched something in the takeoff, so the takeoff was delayed, and then there are curious problems. Litomo said that he received 2,000 kilos fuel less, so he could arrive maximum in Ronchi, where a fuel base had already been organized. Well, question mark. A mistake of 2,000 liters? I don't know. It's kind of difficult. I don't know what Paolo thinks, but here the report says 2,000 kilos, but 2,000 kilos less of fuel, well, I don't know. But this report, anyway, was made immediately after the event, so maybe there could be typos. The military S.79 instead, well, due to the headwind, it could not get to Ronchi, and it had to do a premature, so to speak, landing. And now let's go to the Erbiseo Mussolini type airplane. So in order to allow the arrival in Paris in formation, but since two vehicles were behind, the Piseo airplane sees the other two as 79, as it is written here, in order to not lose sight of the other two airplanes, decides to overpass them to reach Paris in formation. So they reach the Alps, and having to overpass them at a higher altitude of 6,500 reduces the pace, and in this moment there are problems on the engines of the central engine. So what happens? The propeller was blocked at minimum speed. So being a very specific condition, the pilot decides to land in Cameri, the only base having specialized staff to fix these little engines and to stop them to fly. I don't remember whether in the next slides I also showed how the problem was fixed, but they could not fix this engine, so the propeller was put to maximum speed, so there was the central one fixed and the two others variable speed. And for Lirobo, there's an interesting analysis on a wrong assessment of the pilot on the creation of ice on the carburetors. So the plane, as you can see here, can make an emergency landing, which is due to a wrong indication of the thermometer, which created a wrong interpretation from the pilot for the formation of ice. Here I underlined a very interesting part, because yes, it was almost at the verge of the Second World War, but from the aviation point of view, collaboration between nations were very open in order to try and find solutions in order for a plane to always be in flight and safeguard human life. So in the next part here you can read that from experiments recently carried out by England, which also shared this analysis, While in their report, we could read that the formation of ice on the carburetors, butterfly, happens at 99% between 40 and 60 corresponding degrees. It is 70-80% of power. So when the engine works at that power, it is easier, it's more probable, more likely that ice creates on the carburetor. That's why they suggested not to always leave the same power, but sometimes to get to 2000 in terms of power to change the flow of fuel. And then there was this slide, which is very interesting, which gives technical consideration after the race. So we took the one on Alfa 126, which says not a lot, but it says they behaved very well. There's no technical indication. So they never created problems, but the fundamental thing, which is underlined, is that, well, the tests were excellent. They also had a 30-hour test at maximum power with minimum consumption. So in the end, the consideration of these engines is very high. And as specified here, these engines worked for 30 years at high regiments with variations of altitude and temperatures, which were very important. And in the end, well, they won. I then put, in the end, a scheme which shows all the studies which were made afterwards of the Alfa 126 on the competition ones. There's only, I put only one, but there's like 30 of these schemes. And for those who are passionate about the specifications of the engines, well, you can go and check the features. So, thank you for your attention. Thank you, Colonel, for your interesting speech. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you. But a couple of assessments I wanted to share with you after the competition is that, well, the propeller speed was, well, the standard one afterwards, because the variation created some problems. Even 3-4 days before the start of the competition, the installation of the propellers, well, would have been postponed also on the army vehicles, but on the competition vehicles, the Smith and the Sperry were mounted. So Smith turned out to be excellent, and it was then mounted by default, and also the automatic dispensers were considered very positively, and these were also installed. The same goes for the thermometers, while the ACT analyzers, that is the temperature of exhaust gases, but being automatic, but these kind of analyzers became less and less important and were no longer installed. Thanks again. And thanks for these additional details. It was very interesting to read the excerpts of the review that you showed us, especially because one of the fundamental aspects of our backstages is the work done with the documentation center, which keeps not many documents of that specific race, but which has a folder dedicated in general to the records rich with aviation engines and Alfa Romeo propellers. A lot of attention was given that period to the different records of speed, height, distance, consumption. So there's many reviews that every time are kept in these documents, not in the technical part, but in the communication part of the results obtained, and how this could be used to obtain new orders or bring pride to the company. In our documentation center, talk about aviation production, we have a lot of manuals. Unfortunately, we no longer have the technical drawings of these engines, but we have all the documents concerning the contracts. Contracts of Vicenza, contracts for building, for production lines management, the relationship with the aviation, the army aviation, so the reports after the testing in Guidonia, and also all the critical elements which started to emerge during the Second World War, with the difficulties to find materials or decentering. For example, in some fabrics which are not born to be fabrics, like the Costosa caves or highway tunnels. And this is also an anticipation of Backstage we will held in 2023, which we talk about this. Thank you for your time.
Grazie a voi.
Thanks to Paolo Miana, who allowed us finally to talk about aviation and not only cars in this museum. And I thank Volandia, Mr. Raimondi, and as well, I thank our audience here and remotely connected. So see you at the next Backstage.
Arrivederci.